Chairperson, lady, as a token man, it's my privilege to address you for a few minutes, and I'll be quite brief, as Chair of the Adelaide Society and its Health Policy Initiative. And I have three brief areas I want to touch on with you. These are clarity, objectives, and constructive partnerships, all in the context of that very difficult term, person-centred care. In order to do so, I want to introduce you to two of my heroes. The first received the exact opposite of person-centred care by an authoritarian doctor, and bear in mind that our system is authoritarian, the HSE is authoritarian, with central command and control, and our medics are authoritarian. This person was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he did not like his doctor, because in 1862 he said, "My doctors issued his decree that too much wine is killing me, and furthermore his ban he hurls against my touching naked girls. How then shall I, Women's Day, how then shall I no longer share good wine or beauties dark and fair? Doctor, goodbye, my sails unfurled, I'm off to try the other world." So maybe our other world allows us to begin to approach actual person-centred care. The other hero, who was also a great friend, sadly dead, was Geoffrey Rose. And the reason he's a hero is that he wrote, well, many reasons, but he wrote The Strategy of Preventive Medicine, which is a small, compact, black and white book, which is an absolute model of clarity. It's perfect English, there's no jargon, there isn't a word out of place, and it is so precise. And I contrast that when I look at the HSE publications. Firstly, I get hypnotized by the lovely photos of the lovely people on the cover. And then when I try and read the English, I simply can't understand it. It's just a foreign language. I just don't get it. So if that depresses you, go back to the Strategy of Preventive Medicine. And developing this theme of clarity for just a moment, we had a very useful expert roundtable yesterday, and Professor Kika Okma talked about the confusion that may arise surrounding labels such as consumer-driven healthcare, managed care, and managed competition. These terms are often spun to suit the interests of organizations rather than for the benefit of citizens and patients. And managed care, for example, is a terrible term, and it could refer to optimal person-centered care or to the cheapest possible way of dealing with a patient with the maximum profit to the provider. And she also pointed out that the very term insurance is fraught with difficulties. Private health insurance has almost nothing to do with health, being related more to providing high-earning procedures such as hip replacements and bypass surgery to low-risk individuals for profit, and absolutely not to providing optimal health care to those with complex long-term problems. There seems to be little evidence, and this has made me very nervous about our multiple provider plans for this country, that private health insurance is capable of providing either good or comprehensive health care. And she, I hope I'm not paraphrasing you too much, she also noted that social health insurance is a misnomer because it's not insurance. There are no exclusions, payment should relate to ability to pay, and access should be by need. So that brings me on to the next point, which is to just glance very briefly at the Adelaide Society's Health Policy Initiative's objectives in relation to health. These are pretty obvious and very simple, but the first, I think, would be to interpret the term person-centered care literally and unequivocally as care that relates to the needs of the person in the context of a system that allows the person to express their needs and which is capable of responding to them. And it seems to me we're still a very long way away from that ideal. And the third is, well, we would say it, wouldn't we, but is to promote equity of access to health care and its delivery to everybody, regardless of means, education, literacy, education, or social class. These may sound a bit generic, and they may sound idealistic, but what is perhaps new and maybe a source of optimism, and this is my third and last point, and then I'll hand back, is the development of mutually supportive partnerships to replace confrontation. And I can tell you in the Adelaide Society and in Tala Hospital we know about confrontation. Within the Society, we ploughed a lonely furrow during the last administration, indeed for a long time. Whenever we spoke out on inequalities, when we criticised government policy, our words were used against us and against our parent hospital, which was blamed for our independent words and views, until we actually had to gag ourselves, and it really was a terrible time. Where it seemed to us there were shared problems to be solved. Let's take trolleys. I don't want trolleys, you don't want trolleys, the patients don't want trolleys, the healthcare system don't want trolleys, and how do we deal with it? By fights and confrontation. It's absurd. And they were certainly not in the interest of optimal patient care. And indeed, Brian Cowan chillingly said to us once in the Adelaide Society and in the Adelaide Hospital, in Tyler Hospital, don't you understand that you have no friends? None. And that was the sort of strategy we were dealing with. So it's a kind of a sort of joy to me, in a way, that we seem to be moving into an era of dialogue and problem-solving instead of confrontation. And the very fact of this partnership, and I'm absolutely delighted by it, between at this meeting, TASC, the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, and ourselves attest to this. And I think that Fergus Farrell's vision in engaging with Charles, Stephen and colleagues in the Trinity Centre for Health Policy Management has resulted in reports that have informed and almost written to some extent government policy. And I'm delighted to hear that Fergus has also been asked to be involved in the policy implementation. So I'll stop with that. I've sometimes felt like an incurable optimist, whether relating to healthcare reform or to Trinity Health Ireland or indeed to the new Children's Hospital, brackets for Tala, close brackets. But today... Today does make me feel better. It may be that we're moving towards an era of truly constructive partnerships, to move towards a healthcare system that actually is, in its truest terms, form, person-centred. So I thank you very much for listening to me.
Today we've been assessing the government's progress on the promises that they made to us a year ago. And one thing that I'd like to draw attention to is how dense some of the themes, the topics, the terminology can be for us practitioners, for people who are academics, for people who are health policy savvy. I would like to draw attention to how good has the government done on attempting to communicate what is universal health insurance to the general public. If we were to go outside now with a clipboard and survey the first 10 people each of us came across, how good would they be in describing the utility of it? This concept of the European social solidarity model, terms like this might seem alien to people who are not the converted like ourselves. So I want you to think about, as I go through my talk, assessing the government's performance on one of the key themes that Steve Thomas talked about, which is bringing everybody along with them. And the way that they can start that is explaining it. One argument that can be made is to look at health and social equality being better for everyone within a society, even the rich. When we look at health data from Ireland, we can see that low socioeconomic groupings have worse health outcomes overall. When we look at perinatal data, for example, we can see that infant mortality is 3 times more likely to occur in groupings from a low SES background. Likewise, low birth weight is twice as likely to occur in low socioeconomic groupings. Rates of hospitalisation for mental illness is 6 times more likely to occur in higher groups, and 6 times more likely to occur in groupings from a low socioeconomic background. Chronic disease is a topic that's getting a lot of attention both in academic and in clinical literature, and rightly so. When we plot on socioeconomic factors onto that, we can see that 47% of chronic diseases occur in people from a low socioeconomic background. Compare that to the 23% of the general population. So what this data shows is that there is a strong social gradient to health and morbidity and mortality within Ireland. And this goes from cradle to grave. And this is despite the fact that we are actually spending 9% of our GDP, which is around the EU average, on our health services and our health care. But we're obviously not getting good, effective use of our money. One thing that is pertinent when determining health and mortality within a society is less about the overall wealth of the society, but rather how evenly that wealth is distributed. The more equally the wealth is distributed, the better the health of that society overall. And I'm going to present some data that shows that this is a pertinent point for health and social functioning. So how does Ireland also compare to other countries? Minister Riley referred to this book, which is a landmark publication from two epidemiologists from the UK called The Spirit Level. Wilkinson and Pickett wrote it. And a lot of the data that I'm referring to comes directly from this publication. This is a graph that looks at obesity rates within an adult population and plots them across a range of different countries on a metric of income inequality. Now, as I present these graphs, I want you to pay attention to two particular points. One, I want you to pay attention to where Ireland is on the graphs, and the second thing I want you to try and pay attention to is the countries that tend to cluster down the bottom left-hand side of the graph. So what this graph demonstrates is that the percentage of obesity will grow in an adult population as income inequality gaps widen. Now, if we look at some locally collected data, such as that from the Growing Up in Ireland study, which is a longitudinal national cohort study of the health and well-being of our children, we can see that in children there's also a strong socioeconomic gradient which assesses them being either classified as being overweight or obese. Teenage birth rates also increase as the income inequality gap widens. Drug use, indices of drug use such as opiates, cocaine, cannabis, ecstasy and amphetamines, we can see that when we plot them, drug use increases within a population as the income inequality gap also widens. So too does the rates of imprisonment. The number of prisoners increases as the income inequality gap widens. Now, because I only have a few moments, I'm not able to present a range of different evidence, but this is one graph from the Wilkinson and Pickett literature that plots a range of different indices across a range of different health and social outcomes that is evidence to suggest that the more equal a country is, the better the country does on a range of different outcomes. Now, what you might have noticed is that Ireland tends to be in the middle of the graphs. What you also might have noticed is that the same groupings of countries tend to appear down the bottom left-hand side of the graph. And I don't think that's any coincidence that the countries that perform better tend to be more egalitarian or more equal in nature. Where health reform is considered, those countries also have things like mandated health insurance for every citizen and a single payer system and so on. Different options that we're considering within our own universal health insurance. Now, as I said, remember, this is not related to the average income of individuals within the country. So you can see in this graph, all the countries are scattered all over it. There's no one line with the countries cluster. It's not about the average income per person, but rather how evenly the wealth is distributed that will determine the positive outcomes within that society. Just very quickly, when we look at CSO data from Ireland, we can look at things like disposable income. So here's data over time from 2006 to 2010, which is the latest available data to us. So we can see that there's a cohort in our society that have around €22,000 of disposable income. Now, that's not gross income and that's not net income. That's actually disposable income after they pay their bills. Now, you compare that to another cohort of people, around 16% of our society that are deemed at risk of poverty, and 6.2% that are actually in consistent poverty. So there are two quite extremes in our society. Now, there's ways of looking at income inequality, and one of those ways is what's called the Genie Coefficient. And this very simply is a metric that goes on a scale from 0 to 100. If a country gets a score of 0, it means that all the money on the island is equally distributed. If the country gets a score of 100, it means that one person on the island holds all the wealth. So you can see that in an Irish context in 2010, we got a Genie Coefficient score, according to the CSO, of 33.9. Now, this becomes even more pertinent when we then look at the income distribution within the country. We can see that in 2010, the highest income earners earned 5.5 times more than the lower income earners. So it's becomes even more interesting if you look at this from a trends perspective over time and how the data changes. And what we can see is that we're actually becoming more unequal as we go forward. And what's going to be very interesting is to see what happens to the 2011 and the 2012 data when that's released. So we can look at health from a range of different perspectives. But one thing that we do know is that health and social problems have very strong social class gradients. The more equal a society is, the better the health and the social outcomes is of that society. Now, our government has made a commitment to greater health equity, and the mechanism that they've chosen to do that is universal health insurance. This is an attempt to reduce the strong social gradient that we have within our country when we look at different health outcomes. But going back to my original question, what's the public's true awareness of universal health insurance? Is the government on track with describing and disseminating the utility of UHI to the general public, or have they stalled in that effort? This comes down to one key question, which is based upon the idea of how ready are we as a populace to really accept universal health insurance. This could very easily be seen as just an incremental increase to the universal social charge that we've all been paying into since the 1st of January 2011. And if that's seen as just an increment to that existing tax, I actually think that's a real lost opportunity. What we need is a communication strategy that places equal emphasis on very pragmatic, important discourse, like how we're going to pay for universal health insurance. But we also need to present the argument that this will benefit everybody within the society. And that argument is based upon an egalitarian argument that more equal countries do better for everyone. What's very important is that we don't lose focus. Universal health insurance is just a mechanism. The main goal from my perspective is that it should lead to an improvement in the population's health. Thank you.